Dienach was a Swiss man from 130 years ago, whose full name was Paul Dienach. The photo people are currently looking at is said to be of Dienach, though some believe it is not. In fact, there is very little information about this person. Paul Dienach was born on June 24, 1889, and died in 1924, living only 35 years. When he was alive, Dienach was a teacher of German and Austrian German at a school in Switzerland. His father was Swiss, and his mother was Austrian, so he was fluent in both Swiss and German. Later, when he moved to Greece, he also worked as a teacher. Throughout his life, he lived without any fame, so much so that there is barely any information about him. However, after his death, he suddenly became famous. The reason is that while he was alive, Mr. Dienach left behind a diary. After it was edited and organized, people realized it was actually a prophecy, and this became the famous prediction we know today. After it was published in the 1970s, it stirred up a major wave.It. Turns out the diary described a year-long experience in the future, the year 3906, and it detailed the state of the world from the year 2000 to 3906. What is the real story behind all this? Today, let's talk about Dienach. In May 1921, when Dienach was 32 years old, while he was teaching his students in class, he suddenly collapsed and lost consciousness. After being rushed to the hospital and examined, it was discovered that Dienach had encephalitis lethargica, a condition where sleep is the normal state, and being awake is the abnormal one. In 1916, Austria recorded the first case of encephalitis lethargica. At that time, the disease spread across the world, infecting over 1 million people and causing 500,000 deaths, a very high mortality rate. The main symptoms were excessive sleepiness accompanied by severe headaches. The result of this prolonged sleepiness was often death or a permanent vegetative state. When Dienach contracted this type of encephalitis, he suddenly fell into a deep sleep. In fact, this was not the first time he had suffered from the disease. 4 years earlier, in 1917, when the illness first broke out in Europe, he had already been infected once. At that time, he was in a coma for 14 days, but fortunately recovered, narrowly escaping death. Doctors even said that he wouldn't get the disease again. Once infected, a person was supposed to develop immunity. But unexpectedly, 4 years later, he contracted the disease again and once again fell into a coma. After examining him, doctors determined that there was no hope for recovery. His condition was extremely serious. Moreover, Dienach had always been weak and sickly, and this time, he remained in a coma for a full year. Miraculously, however, he woke up. He had fallen into the coma in May 1921, and exactly 1 year later, in May 1922, he regained consciousness. So, although Dienach lived only 35 years, he lost over 1 year of his life in a coma. While he was unconscious, it was his mother who cared for him constantly. But during that period, his mother passed away. After that, villagers and a local doctor took turns caring for him. At that time, Dienach was 32 years old. No one expected that shortly after his mother died, he would wake up. The first thing he did after regaining consciousness was look for his mother. When he learned she had passed away, he was devastated. Although he felt very lucky to have woken up, the news of his mother's death filled him with profound sorrow. He missed her deeply. But there was also another reason for his pain. During the long coma, something had happened to him, something he desperately wanted to tell her. But now that she was gone, there was no one to share it with. In truth, Dienach wanted to tell others about it too. But he was afraid that if he did, people would think he was insane. So he kept it bottled up inside. At this point, Dienach still hadn't started writing his diary. As we've said, Dienach only lived to 35 years old, which meant he had just 2 years left. After waking up from his coma, his body was still very weak. He decided to move to Greece. Why? Because he feared he wouldn't survive the harsh Swiss winter. The Mediterranean climate in Greece was warm and humid, and Dienach believed his health would improve there. So, he packed his things and set off. He arrived in Greece around March, and after settling there, he found a job teaching French and German to make a living. Dienach was fluent in French, German, Swiss German, and Austrian German. Everything went smoothly at first, the weather was pleasant, and he felt comfortable and happy, but unexpectedly, about 6 months later, he developed a fever and began coughing heavily. Although this time he did not fall into a coma, his health rapidly deteriorated. Realizing that he probably wouldn't survive, Dienach began writing his diary, determined to document everything he knew. The result was that just 1 year later, Dienach passed away from tuberculosis at the age of 35. Before he died, he entrusted the diary to one of his students, a young man he was teaching German to. Dienach then packed his bags to return to Switzerland, but he died on the way home. Dienach gave the diary to this particular student because he saw him as very gifted. He told the young man, "This diary is written in German. Use it to practice your language skills, it will help you improve." The student's name was George Papahatsis, and at that time, he was only 19 years old. However, that very 19-year-old student would later become a renowned legal scholar, vice president of the National Council of Greece, founding member of the Greek Philosophical Society, professor of administrative law, and rector of Pantheon University. He became the leading figure in the entire administrative law community in Greece at that time. At 19, after receiving the diary from Dienach, he began translating it at his teacher's request. In fact, Dienach had only been writing the diary for about 6 years. When he handed the diary to his student, Dienach didn't say anything about what was written inside. When Papahatsis first started reading it, he didn't find anything particularly special. The beginning of the diary recorded a memorable love story from Dienach's past. He had once had a dreamlike romance during his school years. He and a girl named Anna had fallen deeply in love. They were on the verge of getting married, but Anna's father wanted her to marry a wealthy man. At first, Anna firmly refused, but just then, her mother fell seriously ill and passed away. Before she died, her mother said, "Please follow your father's wishes. I hope you will live a good life." Having no other choice, and wanting to make her father happy, Anna agreed to the arranged marriage. At the time, she was only about 16 years old. After getting married, Anna was constantly unhappy, and her health deteriorated over time. Her husband's family pressured her to have children, even though doctors warned her body was not suitable for pregnancy. However, 2 years after getting married, Anna eventually became pregnant. Once pregnant, she suddenly became seriously ill, and in the end, neither the baby nor Anna survived. This was a devastating blow to Dienach. From that point on, he suffered from depression, and his health gradually declined. So Dienach was not originally sickly, rather, his decline was the result of the emotional shock from Anna's death. Even when she got married, the blow hadn't been that severe. But after her death, Dienach spiraled into 9 years of depression, and that's when he started keeping a diary, opening it with the story of this tragic romance. However, as Papahatsis kept translating, he found that the later parts of the diary were different. The later content made up the longest and most substantial section of the diary, and it was all about future events. The dates were clearly written throughout the diary. At first, Papahatsis thought his teacher was simply writing a novel. But the more he translated, the more he realized that the content was not fiction. It was a future diary, a first-hand account of all the experiences Dienach had during his journey to the future, and then back again. In the end, Papahatsis spent his free time over 14 years translating the diary. Since he was studying law, he was extremely busy, but whenever he had time, he dedicated it to translating his teacher's diary. After 14 years, he completed the translation. He believed the content was extremely important, and he was absolutely convinced that what was written in the diary was real. So, he decided it must be published. As if by coincidence, he finished translating it exactly in 1940, and World War II broke out. All the European countries were at war with Germany. The book could not be published, because the original manuscript was in German, and at that time, anything in German was treated with suspicion. Even worse, in 1944, when World War II was at its most intense, Greece itself was in chaos, and Papahatsis' family estate was requisitioned by the Greek military. By that time, Papahatsis was already a university professor, and he came from a wealthy family. His father was a famous lawyer, so they owned a private mansion, which the military took over. During the takeover, soldiers found the original German manuscript in his room. He quickly tried to explain, "This isn't a banned item, it's the diary of my former teacher." But the Greek soldiers, not understanding German, said, "We need to take it for examination. If there's nothing suspicious, we'll return it." But they never returned it. The original manuscript was lost. Fortunately, they only took the original version. His translated version was not taken, so the translated contents were preserved. Then, another 5 years passed. World War II had ended. The Greek Civil War had also ended. But Papahatsis never got the original manuscript back. Even so, after the war, he still believed the content of the diary should be published, but he couldn't find the right time. So he decided to first share it with a few close friends, who were not just ordinary people. They included theology professors, mystics, and even members of the Freemasons. He showed it to some Freemasons, and as soon as they read it, they classified the diary as confidential and highly valuable. "This book is too important. It must not be leaked to the public. It must be kept secret within our circle." As a result, the translated manuscript was kept hidden within the Freemasons for 20 years. By the 1960s, Papahatsis was now the rector of a university, and he declared, "I still want to publish this book, no matter how strongly the Freemasons oppose it." Finally, in 1973, Papahatsis published the book publicly, and it caused a sensation across Europe. At first, people were shocked that a respected law professor, a serious legal scholar, would publish something so unverifiable about the future. It led many to question his motives. Across Europe, people were divided into 3 camps regarding the book. Some believed that the content could be true, that it might really be a prophetic vision of the future, and should be studied seriously. Some believed it was a fictional story, meant to provoke reflection on spirituality, society, and the fate of humanity. Others believed it was an elaborate hoax, perhaps with a hidden agenda. So what exactly did Dienach write about the future? According to the diary, when he fell into a coma in 1921, he was actually not fully unconscious. He was in a semi-conscious state. He couldn't see clearly, but he could feel that many people were walking around him, busy, moving him from place to place. He didn't know how much time had passed, but eventually, everything became quiet. He tried to open his eyes and realized he was in a completely unfamiliar place. 2 people dressed like doctors were standing by his bed. Although their clothes didn't exactly look like those of doctors, he couldn't quite describe what kind of clothing they were either. Still, he assumed they were doctors. He asked, "Where am I? Where is my mother?" His first thought was of his mother. At that moment, the expressions of the 2 doctors were full of confusion. One of them said a few things he didn't understand, though he caught some familiar-sounding words. The language sounded similar to English, but wasn't exactly English. Then the 2 turned to speak to each other in another language he couldn't understand at all. Dienach thought to himself, "Was I brought to a hospital in a foreign country? Where am I?" He asked again, "Where am I? What is this place?" At that moment, an older doctor, who seemed to recognize the language he spoke, replied in broken German, "Andrew, you don't recognize me?" He said, "Andrew? Who is that?" The doctor began to explain that due to a head injury from an accident, he had been brought to this facility for treatment. "Don't you remember?" the doctor asked. Dienach was shocked. He jumped out of bed, wanting to see where he was. As he rushed past a mirror, he suddenly realized, the person in the mirror wasn't him. It was a young man. And although Dienach was only 32 years old at the time, the man in the mirror looked even younger, and also looked completely different. At that moment, he was overwhelmed by terrifying fear. He wondered if he had died and gone to heaven, or perhaps some other place. From his speech, the doctor realized Dienach was speaking an ancient language, so he asked, "What year is it?" Dienach answered, 1921. The doctor replied, "Now it is the year 3906. Dienach said, "That's impossible. How can that be?" He ran toward a nearby window, and what he saw stunned him completely. There were glass-like skyscrapers reaching into the sky, and flying cars soaring overhead. Everything looked incredibly beautiful. Dienach said that even though he was a language teacher, he had no words to describe the scene. The only word he could find was beautiful, because most of what he saw was unrecognizable to him. He stood at the window for a long time, dumbfounded. Meanwhile, the doctor seemed to begin to understand what had happened. Then he started to explain. "Your name is Andrew Norman, a brilliant physicist. You were involved in a serious car accident and suffered a critical brain injury. Medical attempts to revive you were failing. You were in a near-death state for 15 minutes. During that time, we cooled your brain and restarted your heart. And it seems that at that exact moment, your consciousness underwent a transformation. It's now the year 3906, and it seems you've experienced a kind of time travel of consciousness." The doctor had figured it out, but what had happened to the real Andrew? No one knew. Perhaps his consciousness had transferred to Dienach's original body, which was still in a coma back in 1921. So in essence, it seemed to be a soul swap between two people in near-death experiences, one in the year 1921 and one in 3906. After hearing the doctor's explanation, Dienach gradually began to understand what was happening to him. He said that his initial panic had now turned into worry and confusion. At this point, he had only one thought: I want to go home. I want to return to my own body. And so, caught in a state of anxiety and uncertainty, he stayed in the hospital for 12 days to recover physically. Once he regained some strength, the doctor took him to meet the elders, who were the wise men of the future, two old men regarded as sages. The elders asked Dienach many questions. They, the people of the future, believed that what had happened to Dienach was a consciousness transfer, in other words, a transference of consciousness through time. While this phenomenon was extremely rare, it was understandable within their advanced framework. Later, Dienach learned something even more astonishing: these people were not exactly human, or at least, not human in the way we are. The people of the future explained that a new species of humans, called Homo occidentalis novis, had emerged on Earth. The biggest difference between them and us was the structure of the brain. Through the course of evolution, they had developed a new sense, a kind of hypersensory perception, a sixth sense that transcended all five of our basic senses. This ability allowed them to perceive dimensions or levels of reality that we cannot. Their midbrain was different from ours, enabling them to directly perceive the mysteries of the universe. They were able to perceive something that we cannot. In their language, they said they could directly sense something called Samith. It was also these people of the future who told Dienach what Samith was, or at least tried to. They told him, "You people of the past cannot possibly understand what Samith is." However, perhaps some viewers might have some idea. Many believe that Samith could be interpreted as Akashic, universal consciousness, or divine essence. They were capable of directly perceiving Samith, whereas we are completely unable to. This kind of hyper-evolutionary perception happened in an instant, like a sudden enlightenment, not simultaneously for everyone, but rather in individuals. One day, you might just awaken with it. This sudden awakening was extremely dangerous. By the time Dienach arrived in the future, every individual of this new human species had this new perception. But when it first started emerging, the mortality rate was 100%. What does that mean? It means that when this hypersense, this awareness of Samith, first awakened in someone, most brains couldn't handle the massive influx of information. It overwhelmed their neural systems, and they died instantly. This went on for hundreds of years. People kept dying, one after another. It wasn't a slow process of adaptation. Instead, one day, people just stopped dying from it. The transition wasn't gradual, it was abrupt. Those who successfully evolved with this hyper-perception became beings who were entirely focused on spiritual and intellectual values, transcending all material desires. They prioritized cooperation, altruism, and the collective good, not competition or individual success. In their society, a person only needed to work for 2 years, beginning at the age of 17. After that, they were free to do whatever they wanted. Their lifespans could last several centuries. It was similar to a 2-year military service. After those 2 years, one earned the right to enjoy all the resources society provided. Food, clothing, and other necessities were no longer a concern. Whatever you wanted, you could have it. The reason Andrew, the person whose body Dienach's consciousness had entered, was still working as a physicist was simply because he chose to. People in that time could choose whether to work or not. If they did, it was purely to contribute to society. And if someone preferred to lie around and do nothing, that was also accepted. Because they had evolved into beings of altruism and high spiritual development, they no longer needed laws like we do today. Their world had no legal system, but it was governed by 3 core principles. The first principle was the one we just mentioned: everyone must serve the community for 2 years. The second principle was the establishment of a fixed rule for the distribution of resources throughout society. Even though all resources were free, that didn't mean people could take as much as they wanted, endlessly. There had to be a system, a rule, to limit consumption and prevent inequality. Their approach to wealth disparity was based not on material possession, but on scientific and intellectual development. For example, you have more knowledge than I do, that makes you a genius. Previously, we mentioned that people of this future society could connect to an Akashic archive or universal database, but then, why were some people more knowledgeable than others? That's because the Akashic, or Samith, could only be perceived or felt. You could sense it, even see it, but you wouldn't automatically understand it. To comprehend the vast knowledge within it, you still needed to study and learn constantly. In other words, you had access to it, but you had no idea how immense it really was until you actively sought to understand it. The third principle was population control. By the year 3906, the global population had been restricted to under 100,000 people. This was considered the only way to ensure prosperity and well-being for everyone. According to Dienach's descriptions, these future humans looked very similar to us in physical appearance. And so, Dienach lived for 1 full year in the year 3906. During that time, he learned their language, communicated with many people, and studied human history which, to us today, would actually be the future. This part of the diary is also the core of Dienach's prophecy. So, what did his prophecies say? Dienach wrote that after the year 2000, humanity would face many severe challenges, such as overpopulation, ecological destruction, CO2 pollution and climate change, poor nutrition, cruel dictatorships and deception, localized wars. All of human civilization would be in a period of extreme difficulty, and this struggle would continue until around the year 2150. By 2150, the global population would reach its absolute limit, and Earth would no longer be able to cope. That was when humanity began migrating to Mars. Even though current birth rates may be declining, according to Dienach, from 2000 to 2030, the population would continue to rise sharply. Today's decline would only be temporary. Population growth would surge again in the future. In 2150, the official Mars colonization project began. Humans started building massive settlements and life support systems on Mars. After 50 years of effort, by 2200, humans officially migrated to Mars. Over the next 60 years, Mars' population grew to 20 million, all immigrants from Earth. Unfortunately, in 2265, a massive natural disaster struck Mars, and everyone living there died. At the same time, Earth was hit by a devastating global famine. Just 44 years later, in 2309, World War III broke out. Dienach described nations deploying deadly heavy weapons against one another. He didn't specifically mention nuclear weapons, likely because in 1923, the concept didn't yet exist. But he described a weapon that could destroy the entire world, something terrifying enough that we can infer he meant nuclear or similarly catastrophic technology. The main battlefield was Europe, which meant that most European countries were completely destroyed. Only Scandinavia and a few secret locations survived. As a result, by the year 3906, the language used worldwide was a fusion of Scandinavian and English. Where is Scandinavia? That includes Sweden and Norway, which were also the regions where Vikings originally came from. These were the places that survived. In the year 2396, a world government was established. Individual countries still existed, but they were all under the leadership of this world government. The leader of the government was no longer someone with political power or influence, but was instead elected from among humanitarians, engineers, and scientists. Private property largely disappeared, all resources were distributed equally. At this stage, Earth began to make frequent contact with extraterrestrial civilizations. Everyone knew about the existence of aliens, and with their help, humanity learned how to move the body using the power of the mind. Although the diary was written in 1923, most of the future it described began after the year 2500. Events from the 1990s or around 2000 were mentioned only in a very vague and general way. Dienach explained this too. He said he had learned about this future history through a device, a kind of learning machine. What did this machine look like? According to his description, it looked like an iPad, but with far more powerful functions. It could project holograms or act like an artificial intelligence that would narrate human history to you. You could ask it questions, and it would answer smoothly and naturally. For us today, that's easy to imagine, but in 1923, that was an extremely advanced idea, making it very likely that he truly saw the future. He even wrote in his diary, "We used to study from books, but in the future, they use this device." This shows just how outdated his era was compared to what he experienced. However, this machine also had limitations. It was pre-programmed not to disclose any information about the 20th century, particularly the 1990s. This was to prevent his soul, upon returning to the past, from altering the timeline. Then, after another 300 years of recovery, in the year 2823, the world economy underwent a massive transformation. There was a global scarcity, meaning whatever was scarce became valuable. From 2823 onward, the global economy shifted to a just enough model. Whatever was useful was valued, whatever was practical was prioritized. This pragmatic system rapidly improved the material quality of life. Science, technology, and the economy developed to unprecedented levels. However, with this great wealth came a problem: materialism became dominant, and spiritual life declined. People became addicted to physical pleasure and satisfaction, and gradually lost their spiritual pursuits. Even IQ levels declined over time. Then, something strange happened. Many people suddenly died, with happy expressions on their faces. Research showed that in those individuals, their brain structure had changed in an instant. A huge surge of energy entered their brains, and they couldn't handle it, causing sudden death. To study this phenomenon, wise people from around the world gathered in Norway and established the Eldison Institute, dedicated to researching spiritual evolution. Of course, people continued to die during the research process. Then, 500 years after the institute was founded, on September 7, 3382, a researcher named Alexis Borga underwent a mysterious experience known as Nebel's Arch. This experience led to stable spiritual evolution. He was the first human to evolve successfully, and after that, no one died from the phenomenon anymore. It really sounded very similar to AI. After his transformation, everyone gradually began evolving, and the original human species on Earth, meaning us, started to disappear. So, before 3382, even though people seemed happy and had abundant material wealth, from the perspective of those who came after, that era was called the Dark Age. Only after 3382 did the world enter what was known as the Golden Age. The above is a summary of the key ideas in Dienach's prophetic diary. After watching today's video, what do you think of this version of humanity's future? Do you believe this could really happen someday? Let's continue the discussion. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below this video. And with that, today's sharing comes to an end.